I need to start this video by making a confession. After I had been teaching ESL for about 10 years, I suddenly realized that I had become a bit careless about something pretty important. This is what happened. As I mentioned, I was in my 10th year of teaching ESL, and I was asked to teach a training course to American university students who wanted to become ESL teachers. So one day I planned to demonstrate a lesson. The first thing I decided that I needed to tell them is that it's really important to have a good introduction to the lesson. You know, those first sentences that you say are very important. You don't just want to tell students, open your books to page 23. Your assignment is to do exercise 4 and 5. But wait, that's exactly how I had been starting my ESL classes recently. I realized that in my effort to get this lesson started, I had stopped doing that very important first step. And as a result, I missed an opportunity to stimulate and motivate my students. So, as I prepared to show my teacher training students ways that they could start to introduce a lesson, I returned to my days as a beginning teacher and began to use them once again with my own ESL students. And I have to tell you, the results were amazing. I could see it in my students' faces, just how much more energized and eager they were to do the activities. And I also felt not only excited about teaching them, but also confident in the importance of the activities that we're about to do. So students need to feel that they are working towards something worthwhile and are doing something really important. And we can satisfy this need in our students by explaining the reason for the assignments and why we are excited about the lessons. So I'm going to share with you here 5 great ways to start your lessons, the introduction to your lessons, no matter what the skill is. It can be conversation, writing, grammar, reading, or listening. And notice that they can actually be quite short and still accomplish our goal of inspiring and motivating our students. Here is the first way. Explain how the skill or technique will help them impress their instructors and other people. And these are the common expressions we can use for this first way. I'm always very impressed when I see students use this technique in their papers. Or, when you use this skill during a conversation, everyone will be very impressed at your abilities. Now, here's a couple of examples of how I use this way. So in our conversation class, we are going to practice rejoinders. You know, rejoinders are expressions like I see, really, oh no, that's great. So these are the words that I say to my students to introduce the lesson. In a different class that I teach, I have a student named Paulo. This morning, Paulo asked me what I was going to do after class. I told him that I had a dentist appointment. Then he said, oh no. And I said, oh, don't worry. It's only for a checkup. And he said, oh, I'm happy to hear that. I was so impressed by Paulo's conversation skills, even though he only said, oh no, and I'm happy to hear that. He let me know that he was listening to me, he understood what I had said, and he was interested. Those expressions are called rejoinders. They are one of the most important conversation techniques that you can use, and today we'll practice them. Now, here is another example. We were going to work on relative clauses, clauses with the word who. Here is what I tell students to introduce that lesson. But first, I write 2 sentences on the board. Then I say this. Last term, one of my students, Angie, wrote these sentences. My classmate who has a tattoo of a monkey won a scholarship. The scholarship, which was for his good grades, was for $1,000. When I read those two sentences, I thought, wow, Angie really understands how to use commas. In the first sentence, she correctly didn't use one, but in the second sentence, she correctly used two. I immediately thought that Angie is probably a good writer. So today, we're going to practice when to use commas in sentences with who, which, and that. After you finish these exercises, you will be able to write sentences like Angie's, and I know you will impress your instructors in the future. The next way is explain how they'll be able to apply the skill or technique in future situations. And here are the common expressions for this way. This technique will be very helpful when you have conversations, especially with native speakers outside our class. Another one would be next term, when you are in the next level, you'll need to be able to use this technique. So here are a couple of examples how I've used these. So in our conversation class, I wanted to work on asking clarification questions when we don't understand what someone said. Here is how I introduce that lesson. If I say to you, my cousin gave me a jigsaw puzzle, and you say, pardon? I'll know that you didn't understand me, but I won't know which word you didn't understand. So it will help me if you let me know specifically which word you didn't understand. For example, you could say, your cousin gave you a what? Then I know you didn't understand the word jigsaw puzzle. Or you could say, who gave you a jigsaw puzzle? Then I know you didn't understand the word my cousin. Today, we're going to practice asking questions about specific information which you didn't understand. This technique will be very helpful when you have conversations, especially with native speakers outside our class. Okay, now here's another example of this way. I use this one to introduce the importance of using transitional expressions to my lower level 2 writing students. Transitional expressions are ones like however, in addition, as a result. Now, here are the words that I say to introduce this to my students. Today, we will practice something that you will need next term when you are in level 3. They are called transitional expressions. Many students at this level, level 2, write simple sentences like, the concert was canceled. Many people were disappointed. Good writers show how ideas are connected. They can do this by using transitional expressions. For example, however, therefore, also. So a more advanced writer will write, the concert was canceled. Therefore, many people were disappointed. Here is the third way for introducing a lesson. And then here are the common expressions for this way. I love reading students' papers when they use this technique. Or, this technique is a lot of fun to use. Now we can let them know how excited we are about this lesson. For example, in our writing class, I was introducing how to use dramatic introductions in their essays. And I say, I love reading these at the start of an essay. I immediately become interested in what the student will write in the rest of the essay. And then another time in writing class, I was introducing the technique for including a short story for support in a paragraph. And now here's what I say. This technique is a lot of fun to use because you can use your creativity. The story doesn't have to be true. For example, one of my students included an interesting story about her son's problems. And then later, I found out she's not married and she has no son. Okay, that brings us to the fourth introductory way. Arouse curiosity about the lesson. Here are the common expressions for arousing curiosity. This is one of the most important conversation techniques. Or, several of my former students have told me that this was the most rewarding technique they have learned. And another, after you learn this technique, you'll actually know more than many native speakers. So by getting our students curious about a lesson through our introduction, we can stimulate them to want to learn more about what they'll be doing or studying in the upcoming activity or assignment. And so here's some examples of what I say. So in our conversation class, we were going to work on using follow-up questions. And so by using a teaser, I was able to make them curious about these. Today, we are going to practice one of the most important conversation techniques. In fact, research shows that people who use this technique during conversations are more likable and popular than those who don't. Okay, then in writing class, I use this teaser when I introduce definition essays. Several of my students have told me that this was the most challenging essay, but it also was the most rewarding. And then to introduce how to use commas, I told them how these exercises would make them special. And this is what I say. Most Americans don't know how to use commas correctly. Several of my American students told me that when they read what they wrote, if they take a breath, that's where they put a comma. And that usually gets a laugh from my ESL students. Okay, then I continue and I tell them, after you complete this assignment, you will know so much more than most Americans do about using commas. That brings us to the fifth and final way. Give the lesson credibility in the eyes of your students. And here are the common expressions for this. One of my former students told me that he started using this technique all the time after he learned it in this course. And another one, a former student of mine is now in English Comp. He told me that he used this technique in his essay and he thinks it helped him get an A. So a very powerful tool for motivating your students is their confidence in your lesson and that it will help them develop their skills. Testimonies by previous students, your students' peers, about how much your lesson has helped them can give your lesson a great deal of credibility. And here is an introduction I used for a reading passage. You are going to read an article about some cultural differences. Former students who read this told me that the information helped them understand the behavior of their foreign roommates and classmates, and even the people in their own culture better. Then in writing class, I use this to introduce the argumentation essay. I recently got an email from one of my former students. In her email, she told me about what she's been doing lately and about her classes. And she said this about her English Comp class. I wrote an essay about nuclear energy, and I used many of the argumentation techniques that you taught us. As a result, I got an A on the paper. As I mentioned at the start of this video, once I had started putting in more effort into my introductions to lessons, I noticed an increase in my students' confidence, motivation, and enthusiasm in the exercises. And for myself, I found them actually to be a lot of fun and creative to put together. So, thank you for watching.